Life has a way of changing in an instant. 1 minute, you're 32 years old, happily married, and making plans for the future, and the next, you're a widow, choosing cremation options because your husband's body is too badly damaged for an open casket funeral. That's what happened to me, Ines. 6 months ago, my husband, Alberto, died in a car accident. That day, I was at home, waiting for him to come back from work. The phone rang late in the evening, and from the very first words spoken by the unfamiliar voice on the other end, I knew my world was collapsing. I was told about a head-on collision, about instant death, about how the rescue team had struggled for hours to extract his body from the mangled wreckage. It felt as though I was hearing that voice through a thick fog, one that engulfed me in an instant and refused to lift for weeks. I sank into a pit of grief, trying to find something to hold onto in a new reality that felt unbearably foreign and unrecognizable. The first few weeks passed in a daze, a blur of phone calls, meetings with the funeral home, paperwork. If it hadn't been for my parents, who took on most of the logistical arrangements, I'm not sure how I would have managed it all. Ines, sweetheart, we've taken care of everything with the funeral home. My mother's voice was softer than I had ever heard it before. Just focus on yourself, okay? I only nodded, too drained to respond. My voice felt foreign, my body heavy, my home empty. I didn't know what to do with myself. Sleep was elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of the past, Alberto's laughter, his warm hands, the scent of morning coffee that still lingered in the kitchen, as if he might walk in at any moment. Then I'd wake up, and for a split second, I'd forget that he was gone. But reality always returned too quickly. A month later, I found a support group for people who had lost loved ones. Every Tuesday evening, I sat in a circle with strangers who understood my pain. They shared stories, memories, and their struggles to move forward. For the first time in a long while, I dared to speak. Sometimes I wake up and, for a second, I forget he's gone, I whispered, staring into the void. Maria, a woman in her 40s who had lost her husband 2 years ago, reached out and gently squeezed my hand. That's normal, sweetheart, she said softly. Grief comes and goes like waves. From then on, the months began to take shape into something resembling a new routine. I handled practical matters. Alberto had left me enough financial security to ensure I didn't have to worry. We had a house in the suburbs, an apartment in the city, and a substantial bank account. I could have quit my job at the marketing firm, but the thought of spending entire days in an empty house filled me with dread. Instead, I switched to part-time work, just to keep myself occupied. The most unexpected change came in my relationship with my parents. Growing up, I had always felt secondary to my younger sister, Sarah. They never missed her dance recitals or school plays, while my academic achievements were acknowledged with nothing more than a nod. But after Alberto's death, something shifted. My parents started calling more often, inviting me over. When they asked if I could help them financially by sending $1,500 a month, I agreed without hesitation. Since then, weekly dinners at my parents' house had become a tradition. My mother would cook her signature roast, my father would pour wine, and we would talk about everything and nothing. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly had their attention. Ines, tell us more about the new project you're working on, my father asked one evening, genuine interest in his voice. I smiled, feeling heard for the first time in a long while. My boss thinks the campaign will bring in a few new clients. But everything changed the night Sarah joined us for dinner. She walked into the living room, 7 months pregnant, and the moment she crossed the threshold, all attention shifted to her. Her figure, her rounded belly, her radiant smile, she glowed. And suddenly, I felt like I was tumbling back into my childhood, where her presence filled the entire room, leaving me in the shadows. Sarah, sweetheart, sit here, my mother fussed immediately, practically nudging me aside to make space for her younger daughter. Do you need another pillow? Are your feet swelling? How are you feeling? I just watched, feeling something inside me tighten into a painful knot. I had become invisible again, as if someone had flipped a switch, redirecting all their focus to Sarah and her pregnancy. That familiar sense of being overlooked, which I had thought I'd left behind in childhood, came rushing back, squeezing my chest. It was the same old pain, like an old friend I had foolishly believed I had outgrown. Who's the father? I asked during dinner, trying to insert myself into a conversation that now revolved entirely around the baby. Have you told him about the child? Sarah tensed instantly, her face darkening as if I had touched on something forbidden. She turned away, carefully pushing peas around her plate. That's none of your business, she said curtly, without even looking at me. I don't have to share every detail of my personal life. Without wasting a second, Mom jumped to her defense. Ines, don't stick your nose into other people's business. Your sister doesn't have to justify herself to anyone. I couldn't help but remember how differently they had behaved when I was undergoing infertility treatment. Back then, they had no trouble demanding updates on my progress and handing out unsolicited advice. But now, any criticism directed at Sarah seemed entirely off limits. But how do you plan to manage on your own? I pressed during dinner, watching as Sarah helped herself to a generous second serving. Kids are expensive. Sarah waved a dismissive hand, a familiar smirk playing on her lips. Don't worry about my child. We don't need anything from anyone. The ease with which she said it almost made me smile bitterly. I should have paid more attention to that confidence, but I had seen it too many times before. Sarah was always chasing some get-rich-quick scheme. First, it was an organic smoothie business that lasted all of 2 weeks, then, a coaching certification she never completed, then, cryptocurrency investments that left her months behind on rent. And now, here was the latest venture. Trust me, she added, patting her rounded belly with a certainty that should have set off alarm bells. This time, everything is going exactly as planned. Dad beamed at her as if she had just announced a cure for cancer. That's my girl, she always lands on her feet. I took a bite of the stew, trying to swallow down my irritation. That familiar feeling of being second best settled over me again. Some things, it seemed, never changed. A few days later, on Tuesday morning, I was at my desk going through marketing reports when my phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. I almost sent it to voicemail. Our conversations rarely lasted more than a couple of minutes, but something made me pick up. Ines? Her voice was saccharine sweet, the tone she only used when she wanted something. I'm having a baby shower at Mom and Dad's next weekend. I'd love for you to come. The invitation caught me off guard. The last time we had spoken with any real honesty was at Alberto's funeral, and even then, she had seemed distracted, as if she were already somewhere else. Are you sure? I asked, unable to hide my surprise. Sarah was rarely this proactive. Of course. She laughed, but there was something oddly forced about it. You're my only sister. It wouldn't be right without you. Plus, I have something special for you. Something in her tone sent a vague unease through me, but I decided to ignore it. I promised I'd be there, already mentally sorting through possible gift ideas. Maybe this was her way of trying to mend things between us, I thought. The following Saturday, I arrived at my parents' house carrying 2 carefully wrapped gift bags, one with an expensive baby monitor, the other with a handmade blanket I had spent several evenings knitting, trying to weave some warmth into every stitch. I hoped the gesture would show Sarah that, despite our complicated history, I wanted to be part of her life. After all, this was my future niece or nephew. I clung to that thought as I stepped inside, but the moment I crossed the threshold, I was hit by an overwhelming wave, not of emotion, but of pastel colors drowning the entire space. It was as if an explosion of pinks and blues had taken over. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked pastries and hints of vanilla. Ribbons and garlands draped from every surface. A giant diaper cake towered on the table, and in the center of the living room stood an arch of balloons framing a glittering sign, "Baby coming soon." Trust Sarah. If she did something, she did it big. Judging by the crowd, she had invited half the town. Aunt Dina was there with her daughters, Mom's bridge club friends, the neighbors, Sarah's former college classmates, who huddled around the punch bowl, whispering animatedly about their university days. I felt her presence before I even saw her. She was weaving through the crowd in a flowing dress that had likely cost more than my monthly rent. Sarah glowed, as always, but there was something predatory in her smile that made me uneasy. Her eyes met mine a few times, lingering just a fraction of a second too long, as if gauging my reaction, as if preparing for something. We played the usual baby shower games, guessing the due date, measuring Sarah's belly with string, and then the nauseating one where we had to identify melted chocolate inside diapers. To my surprise, I won the belly measuring contest, which seemed to annoy Sarah more than it should have. Throughout the evening, she kept sneaking strange glances at me, as if waiting, as if bracing for something bigger. When it was time to open gifts, Sarah was in pure bliss. Every tiny onesie and plush bunny was met with a theatrical gasp of delight, followed by playful commentary. But when she got to my gift, something shifted in her expression. She unfolded the blanket, ran her fingers over the intricate pattern, then, raising her glass of punch, clinked it loudly against the table, drawing everyone's attention. The room fell silent, and my heart suddenly pounded faster. There was something too deliberate, too calculated about her gesture. The air grew thick, heavy, and I was struck by a wave of unease, though I had no idea where it came from. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Sarah began, placing a hand on her rounded belly. "But there's something else I need to share. I think it's time everyone knew who the father of my child is." I froze. The world tilted slightly. A ringing filled my ears, but even through the haze, I heard the guests' gasps and whispers. Aunt Dina raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. Sarah's friends murmured among themselves, exchanging glances. But that wasn't what shocked me the most. What shocked me most was the lack of surprise on my parents' faces. They knew. They had known all along. I barely had time to process what was happening before Sarah spoke again, her voice laced with sickening satisfaction. "Since Alberto's child is his only heir, I have a right to half of everything he left you, Ines. The house, the apartment, the money." She turned to face me, her lips curling into a poisonous smile. "My child deserves their father's inheritance." The room spun. I gripped the back of a chair, trying to steady myself. But before I could say anything, my parents stepped forward, flanking Sarah like bodyguards at her coronation. "Ines," my father's voice was firm, cold, honed by years of business negotiations. "You need to do the right thing. Your nephew deserves his father's inheritance." My lips trembled. My throat tightened, but I managed to force out, You're lying." My voice was hoarse, broken. "You're all lying. Alberto would never." But before I could finish, Sarah lifted her phone, triumph flickering in her eyes. "How do you explain this?" she asked, turning the screen toward me. And my world shattered. On the screen were Alberto and Sarah. They were standing in a dimly lit hotel room. Their faces were close, too close. Alberto was holding her, his lips pressed against hers, his hands resting on her waist, nearly encircling her. I couldn't breathe. Everything inside me shrank into a tight, painful knot. Every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, but the image was too clear, too undeniable. I looked up at my parents. They didn't look shocked. They knew. I turned to Sarah. Triumph danced in her eyes. "Do you see now, sister?" she whispered, her voice dripping with cool amusement. And in that moment, I realized she didn't just want a share of the inheritance. She wanted everything. On another photo, they were holding hands at a restaurant I didn't recognize. A table by the window, soft lighting, a candle flickering between them. Alberto was leaning towards Sarah, their fingers entwined, his expression warm, tender, the same look I had once believed was meant only for me. He loved me, Sarah declared, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the suffocating silence. He was going to leave you for me. We were planning to tell everyone. I stared at her, unblinking, my fingers digging into the tablecloth. But then, she inhaled sharply, as if suddenly struggling for breath. Her lips quivered, and I watched as tears welled up and slipped down her cheeks. Then the accident happened, and all our plans. The world swayed around me. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. I felt my body moving, but it no longer belonged to me. Somehow, my hand found my purse. My legs carried me forward, past the frozen guests, past Aunt Dina, whose hand was still pressed to her mouth, past my parents, who made no effort to stop this nightmare from unfolding. Ines, my mother called after me. But her voice was distant, muffled. I was already in the car. Already pressing the gas pedal, pulling away from the driveway. The road home blurred into streaks of light. My mind replayed the photos in excruciating detail. The restaurant. So he had lied about business dinners. The hotel. So he had lied about his business trips. So he had lied about everything. As soon as I stepped inside my house, my phone vibrated. I hadn't even taken off my coat before the screen filled with message after message. From Sarah. Screenshots. Conversations. I don't love her anymore. We haven't been together in a long time. We'll tell everyone after the divorce. You're the only one I want to be with. I can't wait to start our life together. Each message flashing across the screen was another blade sinking into my chest. Timestamps. They had started months before the accident. While I was undergoing infertility treatments, torturing myself over what was wrong with me, my husband and my sister had been planning a future without me. I spent that night pacing through the house, touching Alberto's things, trying to understand. Had anything in our life ever been real? The first call from my parents came precisely at 7 a.m. I stared at the screen, letting the ringing fill the room before finally pressing answer. Ines, you need to be reasonable. My father's voice was businesslike, devoid of emotion. Not even a greeting. The sooner you agree to split the inheritance, the easier this will be for everyone. Easier. For whom? For Sarah. For you? My voice was quiet, but rage was already boiling inside me. For all of us, dear, my mother chimed in, and I realized they had put me on speakerphone. You don't want this to get ugly, do you? When did you find out about them? Silence. A heavy, hesitant silence that told me everything before my mother even spoke. We've known for a while, she finally admitted. How long? Alberto confided in us 6 months before the accident. 6 months. They had known for 6 months and still let me cry on their shoulders at the funeral. Still accepted my money every month. Still looked me in the eye. Betrayers, I said. A cold, final word. And I hung up. Blocked their numbers. My hand trembled as I opened my banking app, but I didn't hesitate. I canceled the monthly transfer to their account. Let them ask their precious Sarah for money now. 2 weeks passed in a haze of missed calls and ignored messages. Aunt Dina left 3 voicemails. My mother, 14. My father didn't even try. And then came the letter. From Sarah. An email. Official. I opened it. Read it. I will sue you if you don't voluntarily give up half of everything. Voluntarily. I had never seen that word look so much like a curse. I dropped my phone onto the table. I couldn't breathe. Alberto's betrayal. My parents' betrayal. My sister's betrayal. How many other people had known? How many had seen them together while I lived in a lie? Secrets hidden behind lies. The sympathetic looks from some colleagues barely concealed the smirks of others. I could feel their eyes studying me, hear the hushed whispers the moment I entered the hallway or stepped into a conference room. It was all growing, festering, like an infected wound on the verge of bursting. Tom, my boss, and perhaps one of the only people who genuinely felt sorry for me, called me into his office after I broke down in the middle of a client meeting. I had tried to focus, tried to speak steadily, but when one of the partners casually mentioned Alberto's name, I lost it. The words caught in my throat, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Take some time off," Tom said gently as I sat across from him, hiding my trembling hands under the desk. "Paid or unpaid, whatever you prefer. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." I nodded in gratitude. Packed up my things. Walked out that same day and never looked back. The next few weeks blurred into a single, colorless smear. I became a recluse in my own home. Ordered groceries online, ignored the door whenever someone knocked, wandered aimlessly from room to room, endlessly staring at old photographs, searching for signs I should have seen earlier. Every happy memory now felt like a cruel joke. Every moment of my marriage was tainted by the realization that all along, he had been living a double life, with my sister. And then came the news. I saw it on Facebook. Sarah had given birth to a baby boy. The photo showed her beaming from a hospital bed, her blonde hair spilling over the pillow, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. Our parents stood beside her, proudly leaning over their newborn grandson. The baby was wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. I recognized it instantly. I had knitted it. It had been my gift. I slammed the app shut before I could read the comments, but not before I saw his name. She had named him Alberto. A week later, the court summons arrived. A thick envelope, stamped with an official seal. My hands shook as I opened it. But I already knew what it would say. Sarah had filed a lawsuit. She was demanding half of everything Alberto had left me, claiming her son's right to his father's inheritance. The legal wording was cold, ruthless, void of emotion. She wanted the house. Half the money. Partial ownership of the city apartment. I spent 3 days researching attorneys before settling on Richard Martinez, a specialist in complex inheritance cases, highly recommended to me. "Miss Salvatore," he said, shuffling through the papers on his desk. His face remained neutral, but I noticed the slight furrow of his brow. "I need to be honest with you." I froze. "Your sister has compelling evidence of a long-term relationship with your late husband, text messages, photographs, witness statements, including those from your own parents." I clenched my fingers into fists. In inheritance cases, courts often rule in favor of the biological child, especially when there is proof of a relationship between the parents. I barely heard his last words. Everything dissolved into a high-pitched ringing. And then my phone rang. A call that shouldn't have existed. I wanted to ignore it, but something stopped me. "Hello? Is this Ines Salvatore?" A woman's voice. Familiar, yet unfamiliar. Something in her intonation, in the way she spoke, made my heart stop. "Who is this?" "My name is Columbina Lorenzo. I'm Alberto's mother." I grabbed onto the kitchen counter to keep myself from collapsing. "That's impossible," I whispered. Alberto was an orphan. He had told me himself. His parents had died when he was a child. He had grown up in foster care. He had told me. I'm afraid that was a lie. Her voice was bitter, but not angry. We need to meet. There's something you need to know. Something that might help you. We arranged to meet the next morning. I arrived at a small cafe downtown far too early. My stomach was twisted in knots. I ordered coffee but couldn't drink it. And then I nearly dropped my cup when she walked in. The resemblance was uncanny. Alberto. Her eyes. Her smile. Even the way she carried herself. The way she moved. I stared at her, unable to say a word. And suddenly, I understood. I didn't know the man I had married. The man I had believed was my husband, my fate, my one and only. The man who had held my hand through the worst moments of my life, sworn his love to me, made me believe in us. But everything I knew, everything I trusted, had turned to dust. Now, sitting in front of me, was his mother. I was at the funeral, she said once we had settled in a secluded corner of the cafe, away from prying ears. Back row, black dress, a veil. I couldn't come to you then. I remembered her. A lone figure who had slipped into the church at the last moment, just before the service began. I had been too consumed by grief to notice her, but now the memory flared to life with perfect clarity. An elegant woman in black, standing apart from the others, her face hidden behind a dark veil. "Why are you coming to me now?" I asked, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. After everything I had learned about Alberto, it was hard to trust anyone connected to him. Columbina reached into her bag and pulled out a worn manila envelope. Its edges were frayed, as if it had been carried around for a long time. "Because I heard what your sister is claiming," she said, pushing the documents toward me. "And because, despite everything, I can't let another woman suffer from my son's lies." Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the envelope across the table. I opened it. Inside were medical records from Boston General Hospital. Dated 10 years earlier, about a year before I married him. My eyes skimmed the documents, and the blood drained from my face. The truth he had hidden. Complete azoospermia. No possibility of natural conception. The clinical terms screamed from the page, each blow landing harder than the last. I lifted my eyes to Columbina. This can't be true," my voice was barely louder than a whisper. "He was devastated when he found out," she said softly. It was one of the last conversations we had before he cut me off completely. I couldn't speak. All those years of infertility treatments. Endless doctor visits. Hormonal injections. Tears. Self-recrimination. It had all been a cruel game. Alberto knew he couldn't have children. Yet he let me break myself over it, let me feel guilty, let me believe the problem was mine. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Sarah sat in the front row, cradling little Alberto Jr. in her arms. Our parents stood beside her, as if guarding her. She was dressed for the role. A black dress. Minimal makeup. Modesty, calculated to perfection. When she took the stand, tears shimmered in her eyes. "I loved Alberto with all my heart," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want justice for my son. He deserves his father's inheritance." She looked at the judge, but her real gaze was locked on me. She believed she would win. She believed she would break me. But she was wrong. Richard Martinez waited for the perfect moment before speaking. "Your Honor," he said, stepping toward the judge. "I would like to present evidence proving that all of Miss Thompson's claims are fraudulent." He placed the documents before the judge. I held my breath. The courtroom fell silent. The judge flipped through the pages, her expression unchanged. But Sarah's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection." His voice rang out in the tense stillness. The authenticity of these documents must be verified. Sarah lost control. They're fake, she screamed, clutching the baby to her chest. She set this up. She wants to steal my son's inheritance. But Martinez remained unfazed. These medical records clearly indicate that Mr. Zavatari was sterile. We demand a DNA test to confirm paternity. Sarah smiled. A smug, victorious smile. That's impossible, she said, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with certainty. She was convinced I wouldn't be able to prove anything. Alberto was an orphan. She lifted her chin. And his body was cremated. The judge looked at her. So you're refusing a paternity test? Sarah paled. I saw hesitation flicker across her face. She had thought her lie was undeniable. But now, faced with the reality of it, even she was beginning to realize the consequences. And in that moment, I knew she was afraid. Because deep down, she might have always known the truth. The courtroom was silent as the judge opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. Sarah sat motionless, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the storm unfolding around him. The results were final. The DNA test has determined, the judge announced, her voice clear and firm, that there is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Colombina Lorenzo. Therefore, it can be concluded that Alberto Zavatari is not the father of this child. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sarah's face twisted as she broke into sobs, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Miss Thompson, the judge's voice hardened, can you explain why you committed this fraud in court? Sarah clutched the baby tighter. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. I was seeing multiple men around the time Alberto died. And when he was cremated, I thought no one would ever find out. She covered her face with her hand, but she no longer tried to fake emotion. I just needed help. So you tried to deceive your own sister? The judge's disapproval was unmistakable. You used your parents as unwitting accomplices in this scheme? Sarah sniffled. I just wanted security for my child. But now, her words felt hollow. Even our parents looked stunned, finally grasping the full extent of her deception. The judge's ruling was swift and unequivocal. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Ines Zavatari. The judge's voice did not waver. All claims against the Zavatari estate by Sarah Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. She lifted her chin slightly. Miss Thompson, you are fortunate that Mrs. Zavatari has not pursued criminal charges against you for attempted fraud. I felt the tension that had held me captive for months begin to loosen. But it wasn't over yet. Outside the courthouse, my parents were waiting. My mother was crying. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. Ines, sweetheart. My mother reached out as if hoping I would take her hand. We had no idea Sarah was lying, my father added quickly. We can fix this. I said nothing. We've been struggling since you stopped the monthly transfers. I raised my hand, cutting them off. Don't. I pulled out my phone. Blocked their numbers. Right there. Without hesitation. Then I turned and walked away. Without looking back. Colombina was waiting for me by my car. Are you okay? She asked quietly. I surprised myself by laughing. You know who I actually feel like right now? I took a deep breath. I thought about the apartment in the city that Alberto had left me. I had never liked it. Too many memories. I turned to Colombina. But maybe you will. Her eyes widened. Ines, no, I can't. Please. I pressed the keys into her palm. You gave me my life back with those medical records. Let me give you something in return. A week later, when I handed over the keys, she broke down in tears. I never thought I would have a daughter, she whispered, hugging me. 3 months later. My family was still trying to reach me through mutual friends and distant relatives. But I cut those ties too. Sarah sent a letter. She claimed she had changed. That she was sorry. That she needed help with the baby. I threw the letter away without opening it. Now, I have dinner with Columbina every week. We're getting to know each other. We tell stories about Alberto. The good and the bad. She helps me understand that he wasn't only a monster. That his mistakes don't erase the happy moments we had. Yesterday, I finally packed up the last of Alberto's things. Columbina helped me. Some we donated to charity. Some I tucked away in the attic. As we worked, she told me stories about him as a child. Before the lies began. Somehow, that helped. I'm not ready to date. But I've started living again. I went back to work full-time. Joined a travel club. I'm planning my first solo trip. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the woman staring back at me. Life is strange. I lost the family I was born into. But I found a new one. I never expected this. This isn't the life I planned. But maybe it's the life I was meant to live all along. Leave a comment on what you think about this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. See you soon.